everyone. Welcome to Thrive to Learn. I'm Deanna Bruce, advocate for thriving students. I work with K 12 schools across the country on strategic planning and stakeholder engagement, typically at the intersection of health and education equity. I advise, consult, train, and help leaders improve their school's culture, their health, the safety for their students by bringing empathy and equity to health policy as school communities work together to implement what I call student centered solutions or even human centered solutions. I started this vlog to invite others to the conversation. I love to talk to people, hearing their stories and learning from them. And I want everyone to feel empowered to join the conversation to improve their school climate and culture so that all students can thrive to learn. I'm so excited today to welcome Vanessa Ford and Rebecca Kling. Their new book, The Advocate Educator, is a blueprint for creating a welcoming and inclusive environment in classrooms and building supportive school communities for transgender and non binary young people. Welcome.
Thank you.
So good to be
Hello.
here.
Yay, great. I'm so glad to have you. Your book is amazing. I'm going to keep plugging it. But before we get too far in, I would love to ground this conversation in just hearing a little bit more about yourselves. What do you do? Why do you do it? What brought you to this point where you decided to come together and collaborate on writing a book for schools?
Sure, I'll kick us off. Thank you so much for having us, Deanna. Um, I came to this work after 14 years as a teacher in DC public schools and the mom of two amazing children, one of whom is transgender. In 2016, my family met Rebecca Kling at the National Center for Transgender Equality, and we became fast friends. And Rebecca truly helped us with all of our written advocacy and documented advocacy over the course of the years. Since that point, my husband and I wrote a children's book called Calvin about a transgender boy who is supported by his community and school. And then Wiley Publishers came to me and said, "Can you write a book?" And I said, "Sure, but I can't do it alone." And they wanted it to be about supporting trans and non binary kids. And I knew it had to be Rebecca who was going to be my co author. I wanted a trans identified co author, and I wanted someone with the writing chops that Rebecca brought to the table. And it's been wonderful. We've been working together for 2 years, and it just came out in January.
And I
Yay.
am Rebecca, she, her. Thank you, Vanessa. I'm
Sure.
a trans woman based in Chicago, and I really got into this work through theater and performance. I was a performance artist and a solo storyteller, and learned very quickly the power of story to connect with people and change hearts and minds. That's what brought me to the National Center for Transgender Equality, where I helped trans folks and allies that might be parents and family members, that might be teachers or medical providers or public officials to advocate for trans rights and with trans communities.
Great. And feel free to plug your firm. You also consult. You
Yes.
continue to
Yes,
consult.
so I am one half of Better World Collaborative. My business partner, Crispin Torres, and I are both trans. We're both creatives. Crispin just had a performance of his band this past weekend called Wolfman. And the two of us both come from similarly a creative background, a trans identity, and from having worked with nonprofits, having a lot of love for and investment and connection with nonprofits, but also wanting to do something a little more independent. So we founded Better World Collaborative and are working with organizations like the ACLU, the Equality Federation, pushing back against some of this anti trans nonsense.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Which would be an awesome vlog just to talk about that work that you're doing in that sphere. But we're going to come back to the book. I love all the practical tips and actionable strategies that you have in it. I'm particularly drawn to the four principle framework. And Vanessa, I'm wondering if you can sort of unpack that a little bit. How do you see this as sort of a foundation for developing an inclusive classroom and school for school leaders and educators?
Yeah, thank you so much. The four principles really came out of my ADHD and my research, the combination of both, in that when my child transitioned, and because I was a teacher, it made me somebody who schools came to say, "Can you come in and talk to our staff?" right? Can you come in and talk to our teachers? And I, at the time, didn't have a lot of resources. So I started researching like crazy and found every resource that was imaginable from all the major organizations. And the ADHD component is that I needed to bucket those in some way. I needed to have them make sense. And so I ended up finding that they fell into four key buckets of resource. The first was educate, resources about supporting, educating your community, your staff, and your students. The second is affirm, looking at policies and looking at practice and knowing that those are not the same and what they can look like at institutions. The third is include, looking at representation in curriculum and also in marketing and communications for your institution, for your school. And the fourth is disrupt. Interestingly, it was interrupt going into the research for this book, but we interviewed over 50 individuals and organizations, and a number of academics, researchers, and leaders said, interrupt doesn't feel strong enough at this point in time. We need disruptors. And the research is really showing that disruptors are what is making that wave of change. And so disrupt is our final category, looking at ways where you can either disrupt the one-on-one of a bullying situation with students, or all the way up to what Tim M. West of the LGBTQ Institute calls legislative bullying, right? And we talk about in each of these buckets, what are actionable things you can do, resources you can have to get it done. And then the other thing that I want to add before being too long-winded is that we needed to confirm that those principles were right? That they captured everything. And so after we interviewed all those 50 people, we actually printed out the interviews. We coded them for different categories. We saw what we were missing, and it seemed to stand up pretty well. And anything that fell outside of that really was in like historical context or other knowledge bases. But the four principles really stood up as we talked to folks, and they really enriched what we were able to then share out in the book.
Great. And, I spend a lot of time when I get hired by a school is teaching them how to disrupt their own adultism and bias that they bring to sort of serving young people. So that really connected with me. And it sort of leads to my next question that's also about including young people. So, it's really important in your book, you talk about how to not only advocate for, but also advocate with trans and non binary young people. Rebecca, I'm wondering what sort of experience you all have or learned in writing the book about effectively engaging and including young trans and non binary people in the process.
Absolutely. One of the things that can be sort of a balancing act is, on the one hand, we want to include trans and non binary voices whenever we're talking about trans and non binary issues. On the other hand, we don't want to assume that members of a community, particularly youth, should have the responsibility for doing that education or that knowledge. And so there is sort of a balancing act there, or a tension there, of, on the one hand, wanting to rely on community knowledge, but on the other hand, not wanting to force community members to be those educators. And one of the first things that's helpful is to get a sense of what are the needs and priorities of that community. So in the book, we talk a lot about possible priorities in general, but in a particular school or in a particular classroom, what that's going to be is going to look differently. In one school, it may be really focusing on using preferred names, whether or not it's someone's legal name. In another school, it may really be getting a curriculum updated or making sure that language in the classroom is inclusive and representative of the students in that classroom. In another school, it may be how the school talks about itself publicly and externally, and who's in photos and who's on the website, and how the school officials are talking about the school identity. And there isn't a better or worse on where to start from those, as long as it's being informed by the needs of that student body. And in a perfect world, that may come from surveys or audits that are done externally, but at the very least, educators and school professionals can be having informal conversations with students. And we that comes in a couple places. We spoke with a student whose teacher had really leaned on her and said, I want to talk about trans issues. Is this the right way to do it? And at first, the student felt really empowered by that. But on thinking about it a little more, she thought, well, wait, I'm a student in your classroom and you're asking me to take responsibility over what the curriculum should be for my fellow students. And it's one thing to check in or to have that be an ongoing conversation, but she really felt like the onus was being put on her as a student to figure out what the teacher should be teaching. So making sure that those conversations with students are happening where there is room for input, but also not the assumption that students have to be the ones to, or young people in general, have to be the ones to do that education. A really great example of how that can play out, we spoke with Julie Stivers, who's an award winning school librarian. And she was going to speak at a public hearing on some of these bills or policies that would restrict access to LGBTQ content in libraries. And she didn't want to force students or force young people to testify in front of public officials. So instead, she had them share stories with her that she read to those public officials. So she was able to directly elevate the language that her students were talking about without forcing them to do the work themselves. That said, we know there are awesome and amazing students who do want to be public in that way, but we don't want to make the assumption that that's true for all students. So again, that balancing act or that finding the space between absolutely being informed by student needs and student priorities while also making sure that as the adult, as the educator or school official, you're able to take the lead and help turn those priorities into things that into action.
I love that. It's so important to think about it is sort of our responsibility as adults to make sure that we give young people the opportunity to engage, and participate. I remember when I was, at DC Public Schools and we were writing our transgender policy guidance, we included young people, and we worked with a lot of our schools to bring young people to the table to participate in the meetings. We held several meetings over 4 or 5 months to develop the guidance, and one day there was a student sitting next to me in one of our sessions, and they weren't the student that was raising their hand all the time, but they did have ideas, and so I just sort of kept facilitating their involvement by leaning over and saying, "Is there something that you'd like? Could you write it down? Do you want to? Would you feel comfortable writing it down? I could say it out loud now. I can also use it later on when we revise this latest draft to make sure that what you have to say is included." And the student did write down a whole bunch of their thoughts for me, that then we
That's
were
great.
able to bring back to the team. So I love this. I love, figuring out where not only where your school is at, but also where your students are at. So you named a whole bunch of, like, ideas, ways in which schools can advocate. Like, how does someone begin? How does an educator what's the first thing they should do or they can do? If they, wherever they are, how do they start this work?
A great place to start is to doing a little bit of research and digging to figure out just the lay of the land. Are there policies at the school or district or city level that impact specifically around trans and non binary students? And those policies might be positive and proactive, they might be negative and reactive, or they might not exist at all yet. And then similarly, thinking about what is the legal tools at my disposal. So in some states, there are great resources from the State Department of Education or Board of Ed, or from state policy groups that have model policies or that have guidelines. And in some places, there might not be that at all. And in some places, again, it might be negative or harmful to trans and non binary students. And so starting off with just what is the lay of the land in my community? What work is already being done? And that'll help identify those gaps to think about, okay, in my role as an educator, a school official, a teacher's assistant, whatever, a parent, a community member, I've identified where there's room for improvement as well as where things might be strong already. And that's going to give me some insight into what actions I can take.
And I'll just add on to that, in addition to what actions to take, who to take them with, right? We're often saying, don't go this alone. You don't have to go this alone, especially in places that are under attack right now, and their trans kids are under attack. It can feel very isolating, but there are so many grassroots organizations, large organizations, local folks who are doing the work. So in your research, finding out what are the local LGBTQ organizations? who's already leading this at my school? If there is a GSA, who's leading the GSA or Rainbow Club? If there's not, why hasn't there been one? Right. And so the who, I think, is just as important as the what, in that you are not needing to do this alone, no matter where you are in the country. And even after you do all that research and it feels like you're doing it alone, reach out to us and we'll connect you to somebody. Right. You don't have to go alone.
Mhm.
And to be really concrete, let's pretend that my parents in, I grew up in Evanston, Illinois. If my parents were today trying to support a child of theirs who was trans or non binary, Googling things like, or searching online for things like transgender policy Evanston schools,
Mhm.
transgender advocacy Illinois, transgender school law Illinois. So, really, that simple and straightforward to get a sense of what is out there and what's going to be most connected and tied to my role in an education community.
That's great, Rebecca. Thanks for tying it back to the local. It is sort of where we can begin, and where oftentimes our research can be best if we start locally and see where we have resources. We probably have more resources than we even realize locally.
Mhm.
So thanks to the both of you for coming on here today and chatting with us. We're going to add your LinkedIn profiles to the show notes and link your book for anyone that has any follow-up questions and wants to read the book and perhaps reach out to you and ask you any questions. So thank to the both of you for being here. It's been such a pleasure of mine. So, everyone, now we have a new book on our reading list, The Advocate Educator. I want to hear what resonated with you for today's conversation. What parts of the discussion do you have more questions about? What parts of the book are you most interested in? Reach out. Let's continue this conversation. I'd love to jump on a call with you and chat about how we can work together to create an environment in your school where all students can thrive to learn. See you next time.